So, tradition. What is tradition? We're going to use this definition from your book that says that tradition is some practice or idea or object that is at least believed to be continuous or associated with the past. A tradition may be very ancient or very recent, but as an ideological element, it is often assumed to be important, authentic, and even superior to non traditional, especially foreign, practices, ideas, and objects. So here there was. I always use this example of Santa Claus. We think of Santa Claus as extremely traditional. This thing that we've been practicing in during Christmas. It's a very American custom, but the United States isn't really all that old, and it Santa Claus, the quintessential Santa Claus that you see kind of in the top right, with his red suit and beard living in the North Pole, is actually extremely recent from around the 1950s, I believe, when Coca Cola started advertising him as being red, like their drink, like the label on their drink. And after this ad campaign, that's when Santa became red in all of the cartoons and in the popular memory. But Saint Nicholas was in other cultures, was traditionally not. I'm not going to use the word tradition to muddy the water, but was more usually portrayed like this center picture with the blue outfit. Sometimes it wasn't blue, sometimes it was brown, and he was more of this kind of rugged, outdoorsy type character. And recently in the United States, Santa Claus has been portrayed as being black, being African American, which caused this huge sort of uproar among certain people that you might be able to Google or watch the interview with Fox News Megyn Kelly, who had a very she had to come and apologize because she was very adamant that Santa Claus was white and went on this long rant. But actually, Santa Claus isn't really even that old, not very that traditional, and doesn't come from ancient Christian, anything. It really comes from a Coca-Cola advertising campaign, which is sort of more American than really anything else. But she ended up having to apologize for her saying that Santa Claus was not black, because Santa Claus, Saint Nicholas, the actual historical character that Santa Claus is based on, is actually from Turkey. He was a saint in Turkey, which would be pretty dark-skinned people. So anyway, something for you to think about. The most important thing here is a tradition has cultural value. What is chosen to be a tradition is it has a great cultural significance, and sometimes is decided by people who have the most cultural capital, the most cultural power within a society. Remember back when we were talking about the Dr. Fox lecture, these sorts of things. We're building on these ideas. And so a tradition may be very old and it may be very young. It just sort of depends. So, can you identify some traditions in your own culture? Can you think of one that is a tradition that might be very new, but maybe perhaps thought of as very old, or one that's very old and actually is very old? So, how does change happen? How does cultural change happen, and how do something that used to be a tradition not become a tradition anymore, or something that was not a tradition become a tradition? There's two primary. They're not the only ones going to be talking about, but there's two basic ways that new cultural things, new cultural products, new cultural items, cultural ideas, there's two ways that they come about. Typically, there is innovation. That's the invention or discovery of a new cultural concept, idea, behavior, or object. And this is really rare. Invention doesn't really happen all that often. And so I'm using here the invention of agriculture. Now, that's a technology, but it's also a cultural thing. It's to suddenly, instead of foraging and moving around all the time like foragers did, to suddenly decide, no, we're just going to stay put and rely on these crops, is also a cultural intervention. So this picture here is the spread of agriculture, and it only happened in a few places around the world. I'm sorry, the invention of agriculture only was happened a few places, and the vast majority of the world got agriculture from these places through diffusion, which is the other way that cultural products move around the world. The spread of a cultural trait, object, idea, practice, or institution from one society to another. And this is extremely common. This is how the vast majority of ideas move around the world or come into existence in new places. Now, within innovation, which we said was very rare but does take place, there is primary innovation and there is secondary innovation. Now, primary innovation is the invention or discovery of a totally original cultural item, as opposed to a secondary innovation. So I use the example of the Korean writing system. Koreans never had their own writing system for their language. It's a very distinct language from Japanese or Chinese, but for a very, very long time, thousands of years, they used the Korean, or I'm sorry, the Koreans used the Chinese writing system to represent their language, and they wrote in Chinese. But in 1446, the King Sejong in Korea had enough of this, and he said the Chinese writing system was too difficult to learn. He wanted even common people to be able to learn how to read and write, but the Chinese was so difficult. Only very, very wealthy people with lots of free time could be bothered to memorize the tens of thousands of characters. So they just, in 1446, they invented an entirely new writing system for the Korean language. And that was a primary innovation. Now, the invention of writing systems, the very first people to write something down, is only happened maybe three places in the entire world, and then it spread from there. But this was a primary invention. So the secondary invention is an invention or discovery that uses or combines existing ideas, objects, or techniques in a novel arrangement. The adaptation of existing writing systems to another language. So this little island down here near Bhutan, or Bufon Islands, excuse me, they were another nation that had their own language that was distinct from all the languages around them, but they had never had a writing system. And in 2007, this little island here actually adopted the Korean writing system, because the Korean writing system is so easy to learn and well designed and represents the sounds that they wanted. They adopted it, and now this island in Indonesia is using this writing system to represent their language. So that would be a secondary innovation, right? Adaptation of the existing cultural object to their purposes. And, in a way, the Korean writing system was an adaptation of previous writing systems to their own language, but let's not muddy the waters too much. So, how do cultural ideas or cultural traditions disappear? Not all of these just continuously change and spread. They also disappear to make room for new cultural processes and ideas. So that's where we get into these ideas about cultural loss. So cultural loss is the process by which elements of a culture disappear over time through natural or environmental changes, social pressure, or individual choices. There's all sorts of cultural loss going on right now. We could talk about moving away from the Civil War memorials that are being torn down pretty rapidly. That's a cultural loss. It's a piece of culture that we are changing actively because we don't like it. Gender neutral bathrooms. A lot of these hot button issues are cultural loss. So not necessarily in a bad way. Maybe we're changing and trying to get rid of older vestiges, or maybe some people are very upset when culture changes and they don't want that to happen. So there's also cultural loss is sometimes also called deculturalization. That doesn't mean that some places are becoming less cultural, right? No, just certain items are becoming culturally lost. It's not as if you take away one aspect of culture from a group and they become somehow less cultured. Something is always replaced when it's lost. And this brings us to acculturation. Now, earlier we talked about enculturation, so don't get confused. Enculturation is the acquisition of one's own culture. That's what happens when you grow up and you become enculturated into the group that you're going to be living in. Enculturation, which we talked about, day one, is an essential requirement for survival, and enculturation is the very first familiarization process to a particular culture. Acculturation is different. Acculturation is the process of acquiring a second culture, usually as an effect of sustained and imbalanced contact between two societies. Members of the weaker society are compelled to adopt aspects of the dominant society. So acculturation would be, an example of it would be, I was enculturated into American culture, But then I moved to South Korea, where I lived for 4 years, and I became acculturated there. That was my second culture. Acculturation is the amalgamation of two cultures, and now I'm sort of this amalgamation of both. Acculturation is not an essential requirement for survival, but acculturation is not the first, but the second or third familiarization with various cultures. Now, this happens, as this definition kind of alludes to, this also happens on a global scale between nations, right? So you can imagine one society being very powerful right next to another society that is less powerful culturally, militarily, economically, these sorts of things. And so the more dominant culture acculturates the less dominant culture. Now, it doesn't always happen that way. There are when there's a more powerful, dominant society next to a less dominant society. Sometimes the result is genocide, the destruction of a group or society by harming, killing, or preventing the birth of its members. Genocides, the most famous of which is probably during World War II, with the ethnic Jews in Germany. There are other examples, the Native Americans in the United States, and many, many examples of genocide that we're more or less familiar with from high school history. But there's also ethnocide, and ethnocide is something that people are less familiar with. Ethnocide is the destruction of a group's culture without necessarily killing any of the members of its culture. So this would be example. The United States also, committed genocide on certain Native American groups, but other Native American groups, they had this sort of ethnocidal policy where the Native groups were required to send their children to white schools where they were told that they could only speak English and they would be punished if they spoke their native language, and they were taught only, Western European things about themselves and culture and nature, and so they were sort of acculturated into the dominant by force, acculturated into the dominant culture's power. This also took place in Korea when Korea was a vassal state of Japan. Japan had these policies that said that Korean people could not wear their traditional long hair. They had to only speak Japanese. They all had to take Japanese names, and there would be strict punishments for doing certain kinds of Korean shamanistic worship. They were forced to worship at Shinto shrines, which is a Japanese religion. So this is ethnocide, the destruction of a group's culture without necessarily killing any of the members of the culture. So this is also a process of directed change, right? This is a change, a cultural loss or a cultural change that is directed, isn't happening necessarily naturally. A cultural process, so directed change is a cultural process in which internal or external agents make more or less intentional, coordinated, and sustained modifications or reforms to a society and culture. And again, this might be some of our examples earlier. Um, we were talking about bathroom bills, making most public bathrooms mandatory to both sexes, open to both sexes. What were we talking about? We were talking about Civil War memorials being taken down. That would be a directed change. It's not just happening naturally. It's sort of being forced by one group over the other. And again, this is an image of Korean children. Were not allowed to speak their own language and had to read from Japanese textbooks at school. That's a directed change, a directed ethnocide. Not all directed change is ethnocide, and not all ethnocide is necessarily directed change. But these are two related concepts that are not the same. Now, keeping all of these definitions in mind, acculturation, cultural loss, primary innovation, secondary innovation, these are all kinds of cultural change. Now, I'm going to upload this video, which you should watch, called First Contact, and I really like this video. It's very old. It's one of the very first. I don't know how to explain this very well. Excuse me for not being perfectly uh, 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 um, forthcoming. But when you're thinking about colonialism, and a lot of the times in human history, when one powerful nation came into contact with a new people during colonialism, and a lot of these processes happen, directed change, genocide, ethnocide, these acculturation. When a lot of these things took place, there wasn't really a video camera. There wasn't film, there wasn't audio. We don't really get to see it what happened. We just get to hear about it. However, there's this group of New Guinea Highlanders that had never seen the Western people. They had never left the valley in which they lived on this really very remote island in Australia. And these Australian gold miners come into the area, and they have cameras, and they have video, and they have audio, and they have photography, and so you actually get to see in this documentary first contact taking place and a lot of these processes. So as you watch this film, look, and I try to identify as many examples of cultural loss and deculturalization in the film that you can. How many can you identify? See if you can find examples of acculturation or directed change or ethnocide. These will be important. It'll come up in the exam, so make sure you're paying attention during the video and see what you can think of. All right, and that's the end of the last lecture. I tried to keep it short because I know some of you are a little behind on your papers. I want to give you plenty of time to work on those. Again, please contact me if you need help with anything from class. I am here for you. I want to make sure you are all successful. I really enjoyed meeting you all during the first week of class when we could actually meet each other. And I hope that maybe I'll see you in future classes, okay? And do say hi if you see me around campus. Thank you.